For years, I had buried the memory of my girlfriend leaving, chalking it up to incompatibility or some unspoken frustration. She never really gave me a solid reason, only murmuring something about how my sleep habits unsettled her. I laughed it off at the time. I'd asked my friends if I ever sleep-talked when we crashed at each other's places during college, and the answer was always no. So, I figured she had issues of her own and moved on, or tried to. But the unanswered questions festered, like a splinter I couldn't quite pull out. It wasn't until a rainy Friday night years later, when I was bored and scrolling through my phone, that I stumbled across the voice recorder app. I couldn't remember why I downloaded it. Curiosity gnawed at me. Sleep talk was something I'd never taken seriously before, but her words kept replaying in my head. I can't handle the way you talk in your sleep. What did she meant? Was I shouting? Screaming? Whispering sweet nothings to some imaginary lover? With a half smile, I set my phone on the nightstand and hit record. The rain pattered against the window as I slid under the covers. I told myself it was nothing, just a stupid experiment. Still, a flicker of nervousness sparked as I closed my eyes. What if I found out I wasn't alone in the room? The next morning, I felt oddly anxious. I grabbed my phone, half expecting the recording to be blank, but when I hit play, a knot of anticipation tightened in my stomach. The first half of the recording was exactly what I predicted: boring. The faint rustling of sheets, my steady breathing, and occasional muffled city sounds. I rolled my eyes. This is what I lost sleep over? Then, just as I was about to stop it, the timestamp hit 2:13 a.m. A faint scratching noise. At first, I thought it might have been my nails against the fabric, or maybe the sound of my hand brushing the wall. But the sound didn't fit. It was sharper, like fingernails on wood. And then came the voice. Daniel. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. My name. My heart lurched as I paused the playback and rewound it. Sure enough, there it was again. A guttural, gravelly whisper. Daniel. I stared at my phone in disbelief, playing it over and over. Was it me? Did I sleep talk in voices I didn't recognize? Was there someone outside? The sound quality was too clear for it to be coming from another apartment. But it wasn't just the whisper. 2 seconds later, faint but unmistakable, came a low chuckle. My stomach twisted. It wasn't my laugh. My laugh is light, almost embarrassed. This one was dark and amused, like someone watching me make a mistake. I dropped the phone onto the bed and took a deep breath, staring at the ceiling. It's a glitch, I whispered to myself. Maybe the app had picked up interference from another device. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me because of her words all those years ago. Still, the rationalizations felt hollow. I replayed the recording, focusing on every tiny sound. What struck me most was the rhythm. The whisper, the chuckle, the silence. It felt like a response, as though someone was answering a question I hadn't asked. I didn't want to believe it, but the idea burrowed into my mind like a parasite. I spent the rest of the day searching for logical explanations. Articles about sleep talking and parasomnias. Stories of neighbors pranking each other with hidden speakers. Even app reviews to see if other users had experienced weird glitches. But nothing fit. By nightfall, I had talked myself down. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overanalyzing a normal sleep-talking episode. I decided to try again, recording myself for another night. If it was just a fluke, there'd be nothing on the next recording. But as I climbed into bed that night, a thought struck me. What if it wasn't a fluke? What if something or someone was there, waiting for me to sleep? I shook it off, told myself I was being ridiculous, and hit record. Still, I slept with the light on. The second night, I prepared as if for battle. I locked my bedroom door and secured the windows, even though I lived on the 3rd floor and the idea of someone scaling the wall was absurd. I plugged in a small desk lamp, determined to keep the room bathed in light. The thought of sleeping in darkness made my skin crawl after what I'd heard the night before. I told myself I was being cautious, nothing more. Whatever I heard on that recording had to have an explanation, an overactive imagination, sleep-induced delirium, or even an audio glitch. Still, I placed my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and slid under the covers. The glow of the lamp was supposed to reassure me, but it only cast long shadows that danced across the walls as I shifted uncomfortably. Sleep came in fits and starts. I woke up multiple times, heart racing, convinced I'd heard a noise. Each time, I strained my ears, but the room remained silent, save for the hum of the streetlights outside. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and unrest. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, though my hand hesitated over the screen. Did I really want to know what had happened while I slept? After a deep breath, I pressed play. At first, the recording sounded much like the night before, rustling sheets, the occasional sigh, and faint city noise. I relaxed a little, wondering if maybe the first night had been a fluke after all. Then, at 2:47 a.m., a voice broke through the static. "Daniel." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The way it drew out my name was unmistakable, dripping with malice and glee. I rewound the clip and turned the volume up. The whisper was clearer this time, more deliberate, as if the speaker wanted to be heard. I kept listening, my palms slick with sweat. A few seconds later, I heard my own voice, a voice I didn't remember speaking. "What do you want?" The question came out groggy and slurred, but it was mine. I had spoken in my sleep, responding to something I couldn't see. My chest tightened as I waited for a reply. For a moment, the recording was silent, save for my breathing. Then, the voice came again. "You already know." I slammed my phone down on the nightstand, my hands trembling. What did that mean? What did I already know? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but nothing made sense. I hadn't dreamed of anything significant. I hadn't been thinking about anything unusual before falling asleep. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the sound of that voice. It felt personal, like whoever or whatever it was knew me. Worse, the tone wasn't threatening so much as playful, like a cat toying with a trapped mouse. By evening, I had worked myself into a frenzy. I replayed the recording over and over, searching for clues. Could it have been a distorted version of my own voice? Maybe an auditory hallucination caused by stress? But deep down, I knew neither explanation fit. The way the voice lingered on certain words, the way it seemed to respond directly to me, it wasn't random. Despite my fear, I decided to record another night. Part of me thought about calling a friend to stay over, but I dismissed the idea. This was my problem, and dragging someone else into it felt selfish, or worse, dangerous. Before bed, I moved a chair in front of the locked door and made sure the windows were still secure. I stared at the phone for a long time before hitting record. "Just one more night," I whispered to myself. "Then I'll stop." But even as I said it, I knew I wouldn't. By the third night, I was convinced I couldn't handle this alone. The whispers, the laughter, the way the voice responded. It all felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, one that was slowly unraveling my sanity. So I called Josh. Josh was my go-to for anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't just a good friend. He had a level-headedness that I desperately needed right now. I explained everything over the phone, leaving out no detail, even though it made me feel ridiculous. "You're stressed," he said, his voice laced with doubt. "Sleep deprivation can mess with your head, dude." "It's not that," I argued. "I'm telling you, there's something here. I've got proof." There was a long pause before he sighed. "Fine, let me hear it." I hesitated. Playing the recordings for someone else felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I needed him to believe me. I hit play and let the audio run. The moment the gravelly voice whispered my name, Josh's expression shifted from skepticism to discomfort. When it laughed, he flinched. "Okay," he said slowly. "Yeah, that's not normal." That night, Josh arrived with a flashlight and a baseball bat, like he was preparing for a home invasion. We tried to keep things light, joking about ghosts and poltergeists, but the tension was thick. Josh set up camp on the couch, muttering, "If I hear anything, I'm coming in swinging." I laughed nervously, though I wasn't sure if he was joking. I placed my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and crawled into bed. Despite the safety net of having Josh there, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the apartment made my skin prickle. I kept staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. My heart was racing so fast, I wondered if I'd fall asleep at all. Sometime around 3 a.m., I felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, like the heat had been sucked out of the room. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, my breath visible in the dim light of the desk lamp. My eyes snapped open, scanning the room for anything out of place. Nothing moved, but the air was heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I found Josh in the kitchen, pale and hollow-eyed. He was gripping a mug of coffee, though it didn't look like he'd taken a sip. "You okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Josh looked at me, his jaw tight. "Dan, you need to leave. Get out of here. Just go." "What happened?" He shook his head, his eyes darting to the shadows in the room. "I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But there's something here, and it doesn't want you staying." "Josh!" "Don't!" he snapped, his voice trembling. "I don't even know how you've lasted this long. I'm serious, man. Pack your shit and leave." He wouldn't say anything else. No details, no explanation, just that I had to go. He left soon after, muttering under his breath about shadows moving when they shouldn't. I stood alone in my empty apartment, the weight of his words sinking in. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just in my head. After Josh left, his words stayed with me like a bitter aftertaste. Pack your shit and leave. But it wasn't just his warning that unnerved me. It was his silence. Josh wasn't the type to scare easily, and for him to clam up like that, it terrified me more than anything he could have described. I knew I should take his advice, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing what was happening. If I ran now, I'd be running forever. So, I turned back to the recordings. For hours, I played them on a loop, poring over every second for something I might have missed. That's when I heard it. In the background of the second night's recording, faint but unmistakable, was a rhythmic tapping. I leaned closer to my laptop, replaying the sound again and again. The taps were deliberate, evenly spaced, like footsteps circling my bed. That night, I decided audio wasn't enough. I needed visual proof, if only to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. I set my phone on a stack of books across the room, angling it to capture as much of the bedroom as possible. The tiny camera felt like a lifeline, a shield against whatever was happening. Sleep came slowly, if at all. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made my heart race. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, repeating the same mantra over and over. It's nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing. The next morning, I woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands, half expecting the footage to be blank. But as I scrolled through the timeline, a timestamp caught my eye. 3:11 a.m. At first, the video seemed normal. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the desk lamp. Nothing moved, but then the shadows in the far corner of the room shifted. It wasn't subtle, like the flicker of a tree branch outside. It was deliberate. The shadows rippled and expanded, darkening the corner until it was pitch black. My breath hitched as I watched, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. And then the whispers started. They weren't faint or garbled like before. They were loud, clear enough for the mic to catch every word. You're not alone. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The words echoed in my head, blending with the memory of the shifting shadows. My mind raced through explanations, tricks of light, camera malfunctions, my own paranoia. But none of them fit. The whispers weren't just random sounds. They were directed at me. Whatever was in my apartment wasn't content with lurking in the background anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I paced the apartment, my thoughts spiraling. Every corner felt darker, every creak louder. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For the first time, I seriously considered running, packing a bag, leaving everything behind, and never looking back. But then I thought about the shadows. If they could move here, what was stopping them from following me? Leaving wouldn't guarantee safety. It might only make things worse. That night, I didn't set up the camera. I didn't hit record. I didn't want to know what else was lurking in the dark. But the thought of going to sleep without answers filled me with dread. I wasn't sure which was worse, knowing or not knowing. By the time evening rolled around, I was a wreck. The events of the past few nights felt like a fever dream that wouldn't break. I jumped at every noise, flinched at every shadow. When my landlord knocked on the door, I almost didn't answer, fearing what might be waiting on the other side. It turned out to be something entirely mundane. He'd come to check on a leaky pipe in the bathroom. I'd noticed the dripping weeks ago, but hadn't thought much of it until now. The idea of a stranger poking around my apartment filled me with unease, even if he was supposed to be there. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes, he said cheerily as he stepped inside, toolbox in hand. I nodded, trying to muster some semblance of normalcy. He went about his work, whistling off-key while I hovered near the doorway, unable to focus on anything but the sound of water dripping into the sink. As he packed up his tools, he glanced at me, his tone casual, but his words anything but. The last tenant didn't stay long either. Weird stuff kept happening. I stiffened. What do you mean, weird stuff? Oh, nothing serious, he said with a shrug. Just noises mostly. Whispering. They thought it was the building settling or the neighbors. Guess it wasn't. My heart was pounding now, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What do you mean? Guess it wasn't. He paused, tapping the edge of his toolbox. Well, they said they kept hearing things, voices, footsteps, that kind of thing. Thought they were going crazy. Ended up breaking the lease early. Never got the full story, though. I forced a smile and nodded as if this information hadn't just sent my mind spiraling. He left soon after, giving me a friendly wave and a reminder to call if the pipe acted up again. As soon as the door clicked shut, I collapsed onto the floor, my head in my hands. The landlord's words repeated in my mind like a broken record. Guess it wasn't. I looked around the apartment, suddenly hyper-aware of every detail. The building wasn't old, not the kind of place where you'd expect creaks and groans in the walls. The neighbors were far enough away that their voices would barely register, let alone sound like they were in the same room. So, what had the last tenant heard? My eyes drifted to the bathroom door. It was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The leaky pipe had been fixed, but the dripping sound still echoed in my mind, as if it were coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't reach. I sat in the hallway for what felt like hours, staring at that door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. I thought about all the nights I'd spent in this apartment, blissfully unaware of what might have been watching me. The building wasn't old. The neighbors weren't close. The whispers weren't imaginary. I wasn't alone. And the worst part? I had no idea what it wanted, or if it had already gotten it. After the landlord left, his words lingered in my head like an unshakable whisper. Weird stuff kept happening. Guess it wasn't. The connection was becoming harder to deny. If the last tenant had experienced something similar, what did that mean for me? Had this thing, whatever it was, been here all along? I spent hours pacing my apartment, replaying recordings, scanning the footage, and obsessing over every tiny anomaly. None of it brought clarity, only more questions. By the time night fell, my thoughts turned to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my ex Rachel. Rachel had left me abruptly. No fights, no dramatic blowouts. Just a vague excuse about my sleep habits and the way I acted at night. At the time, I'd assumed it was an easy out for her to leave the relationship. But now, with everything going on, I couldn't help but wonder if there had been more to it. I found her number buried in my contacts and stared at it for a long time before dialing. The phone rang several times before she answered. Daniel? Her voice was hesitant, guarded. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. Sorry to call out of the blue. I need to ask you something. There was a pause, then a sigh. This is unexpected. What's going on? I hesitated, unsure how to begin. You remember when we were together, and you said you couldn't handle the way I acted in my sleep? Her tone shifted instantly, becoming sharper. Why are you bringing this up now? I need to know what you meant, I said, my voice cracking. It's important. I've been recording myself while I sleep, and some weird things are happening. I think it's connected to what you said back then. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. Rachel? I prompted. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and trembling. Daniel, why are you still there? Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. Wait, you mean you heard it too? Another pause. When she spoke again, her words were barely above a whisper. I didn't leave because of you. I left because of it. My throat tightened. What do you mean? What is it? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what it is. All I know is that it doesn't leave you alone. It doesn't stop. I couldn't handle it anymore, and I didn't think you'd believe me, so I just left. Her words left me reeling. I wanted to press her for more details, but before I could, she said, I can't talk about this anymore, and hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone in disbelief. Rachel's reaction confirmed what I'd been dreading. This wasn't just in my head. It wasn't something I could explain away with logic or dismiss as stress. She had heard it too. I thought about the landlord's comment, about the last tenant breaking their lease. And now Rachel's confession. A pattern was emerging, and I was beginning to see the outline of something much darker than I'd anticipated. If she had fled from it, and the previous tenant had done the same, then why was I still here? Because you can't leave, a voice in my head whispered. The thought chilled me. I wasn't just dealing with a haunting or a bad dream. This was something worse, something that wouldn't let me go, even if I wanted to. By now, the fear was consuming me. It wasn't just the shadows in the recordings, or the whispers calling my name, or even Rachel's terrified confession. It was the sense of being watched, that heavy, oppressive feeling of eyes on me even when I was alone. I needed answers. The phone recordings weren't enough anymore. They felt passive, unreliable. I went out and bought a voice-activated recorder, the kind investigators used to pick up faint sounds. If something or someone was in my apartment, this device would catch it. When I got home, I placed the recorder on my nightstand and spoke aloud, my voice shaky. If there's anything here, I want to know. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom that night. Instead, I curled up on the couch in the living room, clutching a blanket like a child afraid of monsters. The recorder was running, capturing every creak, every breath, every moment of silence. Morning came slowly, and with it, a deep, gnawing dread. I grabbed the recorder and pressed play. At first, it sounded normal, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the building settling. Then, around 2:30 a.m., it started. A low, dragging sound. It wasn't subtle or faint. It was loud, deliberate, and chillingly slow. The sound of something heavy being pulled across the floor. I froze, glancing around the room. Nothing had moved. The furniture was exactly where I'd left it. My pulse quickened as the dragging noise continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly with a loud bang. And then came the voice. He knows now. The words were sharp, guttural, and filled with malice. My chest tightened, and my breath came in short gasps as I replayed the clip, each repetition sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What did it mean by, he knows now? Did it know I was recording? Did it know I was trying to understand it? And why did it sound so angry? That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. Every bulb in the apartment burned brightly as I sat on the couch, clutching the recorder like it was some kind of shield. I kept my phone nearby, debating whether to call anyone, but I couldn't think of a single person who would believe me. The hours dragged on, and I didn't dare sleep. My mind kept circling back to Rachel, to the landlord's comments, to the whispers in the shadows. This wasn't just some passing phenomenon. It was something aware. And now, I was sure of one thing. It wasn't just haunting my apartment. It was haunting me. 2 days had passed since the voice on the recorder said, he knows now. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the dragging sound in my mind, feel the weight of the words pressing on my chest. Even during the day, I jumped at the slightest noise, convinced the shadows in my apartment were watching me. That morning, groggy and defeated, I trudged back into my bedroom for a fresh shirt. As I reached for the closet, something caught my eye, deep, jagged scratches on the wall near the bed. I froze. The grooves were long and uneven, like someone or something had clawed at the plaster. My first thought was an animal, but I lived on the 3rd floor. No pets, no pests. And besides, these marks weren't random. They looked purposeful, like an angry message scrawled into the walls. I ran my fingers over the gouges, the edges sharp and crumbling under my touch. I knew for a fact they hadn't been there the night before. I grabbed my phone and texted Josh. Something scratched my wall. I don't know what's happening, man. I'm losing it. His reply came almost instantly. Dude, get out of there. You don't owe the place anything. I stared at the message, feeling both comforted and paralyzed. Josh didn't understand. It wasn't just about the apartment. Sure, I could pack up and leave, break the lease, eat the financial hit. But would it even matter? Would it follow me? I didn't text back. What could I say? I think I'm being haunted by something that might not care where I live. Even Josh, with all his empathy, wouldn't know what to do with that. Instead, I spent the day aimlessly wandering the city, hoping fresh air would clear my head. But even out in the open, I felt the weight of the apartment clinging to me, like an invisible tether pulling me back. By nightfall, I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. I sat on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing, my recorder sitting untouched on the coffee table. I didn't want to know what might happen if I used it again. Around midnight, the whispers started. They were faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. But as the minutes ticked by, they grew louder, more insistent. Leave, leave, leave. The word came in waves, overlapping and blending together like a twisted chorus. My hands trembled as I pressed them against my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were everywhere. I stumbled toward the front door, gripping the handle like it was a lifeline. But I couldn't bring myself to turn it. My feet felt glued to the floor. I wasn't sure if the whispers were warning me to leave or daring me to stay. Leave. The voices were louder now, almost a shout. The air in the apartment felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, choking me. Leave. I dropped to the floor, gasping for breath, my mind racing. If this thing wanted me gone, why hadn't it done something worse already? And if it didn't want me here, why did I feel like it was holding me in place? The whispers stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving the apartment in a suffocating silence. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to think. By the time the sun rose, I was still sitting there, staring at the scratches on the wall. The message was clear, but the intent wasn't. Was I supposed to run? Or had the Real warning been that running wouldn't save me at all? I'd finally reached my breaking point. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. The whispers, the scratches, the voice on the recorder, none of it felt like it belonged to my world anymore. Whatever was happening here was beyond me, and I couldn't take it another second. I started packing that morning, throwing clothes into suitcases and stacking boxes with trembling hands. But the more I packed, the heavier the air in the apartment felt. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, disapproving of my decision to leave. As I emptied my closet, I noticed something shoved into the far back corner, crumpled and forgotten. My fingers closed around it, pulling out a small, yellowed piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, my heart pounding. The paper was old, the edges brittle, and the ink smudged, but the writing was unmistakable. In jagged, frantic handwriting, it read, "It doesn't let you go." My stomach lurched. I had no idea where the note had come from or how long it had been there. The handwriting didn't look familiar. Had the previous tenant left it behind? Or had it been there even longer? The idea chilled me to the core. If this was a message from someone else who had lived in this apartment, then they had experienced the same things I was now, and they hadn't escaped. My hands shook as I reread the words, over and over. The message wasn't just a warning. It felt like a confession, a desperate plea from someone who had tried and failed to get out. I shoved the note into my pocket and continued packing, though my movements were slower, more hesitant. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was already too late, that no matter how fast I worked, no matter where I went, this thing would follow. By the time night fell, I'd barely made a dent in my packing. My suitcase sat half-zipped on the floor, clothes spilling out, and the boxes were haphazardly taped, as if I'd given up halfway through. I didn't bother setting up the recorder. I didn't need it anymore. The presence in the apartment was palpable now, as real as the furniture around me. I could feel it everywhere, in the corners of the room, in the shadows under the bed, in the empty hallway outside my door. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the crumpled note in my hand. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. If it didn't let me go, what would it do if I tried to leave? Was I safer staying here, trapped in its territory, than risking whatever might happen if I fled? The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, like the apartment itself was breathing. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light made me jump. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from the bedroom. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking against the walls. My eyes darted to the hallway, half expecting to see shadows spilling out of the room. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "Daniel." My blood turned to ice. It was the same voice from the recordings, only now it wasn't coming from my phone. It was here, in the room with me. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the note in my hand, like it could somehow protect me. The words echoed in my mind, blending with the voice that now filled the apartment. "It doesn't let you go." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Whatever was in the apartment had made itself clear. I could pack, I could plan, I could try to run, but it was always one step ahead of me. And deep down, I knew the truth. It had never been about the apartment. It had always been about me. The final night came sooner than I expected. Every day leading up to it had been a blur of panic and exhaustion, a futile effort to escape something I didn't fully understand. But I'd made up my mind. I was leaving, no matter what. By now, the fear felt like a constant hum in my chest, less sharp but no less consuming. I didn't even feel like myself anymore. Every decision I made felt like it was being observed, judged. Still, I told myself it was over. This was the last night I would spend in this place. The apartment was nearly empty. Most of my belongings were packed into suitcases and boxes stacked by the front door. Only the essentials remained: a chair, a lamp, the recorder. I set the recorder on the floor by the couch, where I'd spent the last few nights sleeping. I wasn't expecting to catch anything new, but some part of me wanted closure. I pressed record. "This is the last time," I whispered, as much to myself as to the presence I could feel in the room. I didn't sleep much, just dozed off in fits and starts. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by a noise, a creak, a thud, a whisper too faint to make out. At some point, I stopped opening my eyes. It didn't matter. Whatever was here would make itself known if it wanted to. When dawn broke, I sat up, the dim gray light filtering through the curtains. I reached for the recorder with a shaky hand, dreading what I might hear. The first few minutes were quiet, just the faint rustling of me shifting on the couch. Then came the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like a dozen voices speaking over each other. But as the recording continued, one voice rose above the rest, clear and unmistakable. "You can't leave." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice continued, low and deliberate. "You're mine." My skin crawled as I listened to the final moments of the recording. After the voice spoke, there was silence, followed by a creaking sound. The front door. I looked up sharply, my eyes darting to the door. It was ajar, the heavy metal slab hanging open by a few inches. A draft of cold morning air drifted in, sending chills down my spine. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. I hadn't opened the door. I was sure of that. My bags were still by the couch, untouched. Everything was as I had left it, except for the door. I took a step closer, my mind racing. Did this mean it wanted me to leave? Or was this another warning? Another reminder that no matter where I went, I wouldn't be free? I hesitated in the doorway, staring out into the empty hallway. The world outside felt impossibly distant, as if it were mocking me with its normalcy. Behind me, the apartment seemed to pulse with a silent, waiting presence. I glanced back at my packed bags, then at the recorder still sitting on the floor. And then, for the first time in days, I asked myself the question I'd been too afraid to confront. If I left, would it follow? If I stayed, would I survive? I didn't have an answer, and honestly, I still don't.